really efficient. You just know what to do to.
All right, we're going to operate under the assumption that this is everyone's here because I think it's already past start time.
Just 15.
Okay, so we're finishing up chapter 19. Greater men than me could finish 19 and then go on into 20. Well, I just have so much to talk about with the ending of 19. And, like week 1, when we started, it was a lot of background information. We talked about when was the book written, who wrote it, what were some of the stuff going on at the time, right before it was written, or right around the time it was written. And now we're going to put a little bit of that to use, and we're going to get into a little bit more historical stuff, okay? But I promise it has a purpose, okay? I'm not just here to teach a history class. It has a purpose. But you need a pen? All right, so we're going to start in verse 28. It says, after Jesus had said this, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. As he approached Bethphage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, why are you untying it, say, the Lord needs it. Those who were sent ahead went and found it just as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, why are you untying the colt? They replied, the Lord needs it. They brought it to Jesus, threw their cloaks on the colt, and put Jesus on it. As he went along, people spread their cloaks on the road. When he came near the place where the road goes down the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, Teacher, rebuke your disciples. I tell you, he replied, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and your children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's commanding you. So here's how this is going to go. You have your first bullet point set of blanks, and we're going to get that out of the way, and then I'm going to talk for a really long time to get into the boring stuff, I guess. A lot of historical background as to what exactly we're talking about here. And then we'll get back into the blanks and it'll go smoothly. But as always, I have the blanks, one, because through trial and error, I realized that this is what people like the most. I used to ask questions, but then no one ever wanted to answer the questions. I used to just sort of let people take their own notes, and then people never knew, well, what's the important part I'm supposed to write down, what's not. People like having the blanks because they can take this home and say, okay, if I didn't understand anything else, at least I have this. If you get lost in the historical stuff, just focus on the blanks, I guess. But it seems pretty obvious that Jesus is referring to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. That's the first half of that blank on the bullet point, AD 70, at the hands of Rome. All right, so, Jerusalem was destroyed a couple times, right? It was taken by Babylon. And, that's when the exile happened in the Old Testament, and they were carried away. And then, eventually, when Babylon was conquered, they were allowed to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. So they rebuilt it and, rebuilt the wall, rebuilt the temple, all of this. Then, Jesus came onto the scene, AD 30, 33, somewhere in there. He died and ascends back into heaven. You have a few decades where, the church is expanding and the gospel's going out. In AD 70, right, a lot of stuff changes. And Jerusalem is, not just taken by Rome, but I mean, it's like completely destroyed, right? Including the temple, which to this day has never been rebuilt, right? That's a big part of like even modern day current Jewish religion, or even like non-religious Jews. I mean, that's still a huge part of their culture, right? Okay. So now is the part where I just talk for a really long time giving you background information. So just pretend like we don't know that. Pretend like we don't know for a fact that what Jesus is referring to here is the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 by Rome. All right, and let's examine why this is the best interpretation, why this is the case. All right, so we're not necessarily going in order with Jesus's prophecy here, right, which really starts in like verse 41 and runs through verse 44. I'm kind of going out of order, but verse 44, he says, "They will dash you to the ground, you and your children within your walls." All right. So I've talked about the destruction of Rome before, but never here. All right. When I was at Talala and I was covering some of the minor prophets, I got into a little bit there. And there's two main sources of information where we get most of our knowledge about Jerusalem being destroyed. One of them is a guy named Josephus. You might have heard of him. He's a Jewish historian, and he wrote a little bit about Christianity as well. I don't remember if he actually wrote directly about Jesus or not, but a lot of Christians like him, right? He sort of backs up a lot of what Christians have to say about the spread of Christianity. So on the one hand, you have a Jewish historian, his name is Josephus. On the other hand, you have a Roman historian, his name is Tacitus. All right, the names aren't that important, but there's sort of a question as to, okay, well, how reliable of a narrator, I guess, so to speak, are these people? Because they disagree over how many people actually died when Jerusalem fell to the hand of Rome. Josephus came up with a pretty crazy number. He said 1.1 million, so over 1 million people, all right, which most people today say that's probably not accurate because you can't fit 1 million people in Jerusalem, especially back then. On the other hand, you have Tacitus, the Roman historian, and he wrote the total number of the besieged of every age in both sexes amounted to 600,000. So you have anywhere between 600,000 to 1 million people, and that's like every age group, old, young, infants, on death's row from being so old, male, female, that's everyone. And that's still like a huge gap, right, between 600,000 and 1 million, somewhere in there. Probably closer to the 600,000 number, just from the size of Jerusalem. But Josephus, for as much as he might not be accurate as to the number of people that were actually killed or were a part of this siege, he's pretty accurate in describing the brutality of the people inside Jerusalem who were affected by this siege. So I'm going to rattle off a couple quotes to you, and we'll talk about it. So one of his quotes, he says, "Children pulled the very morsels that their fathers were eating out of their very mouths, and what was still more to be pitied, so did the mothers do as to their infants. And when those that were most dear were perishing under their hands, they were not ashamed to take from them the very last drops that might preserve their lives." So you have children that are stealing food from their parents, and then parents that are stealing food from their infant children, right? And I mean, this is, of course, because when you think of a siege, you often think of the warfare aspect, but obviously part of that is if nothing's coming in and nothing's coming out, that means no food, no supplies is coming in and out, right? So these people were literally starving to death. Josephus even describes one woman, not to be graphic, but describes one woman who actually ate her own child, right? So you even have cannibalism being described because of the severity of this siege and the starvation and the famine and all of that going on, right? I think the quote, though, from Josephus that best relates to Jesus's words here, "They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls," is this. He writes, he says, "While the holy house or while the temple was on fire, everything that was plundered that came to hand, and 10,000 of those that were caught were slain. Nor was there any difference made between age or reverence of gravity, but children and old men and profane persons and priests were all slain in the same manner. So Jesus here predicts, right, because we're in like AD 30 something, right? Jerusalem fell in AD 70, right? So we're 40 years or whatever before Jerusalem fell. Jesus makes this prophecy, verse 44, they will dash you to the ground, you and your children within your walls, right? You and your children, old, young, it doesn't matter. Male, female, doesn't matter. All of you are going to get dashed. You're all going to get killed. And that's basically what Josephus says, right? Children and old men, right? Young and old. Profane person and priest. It doesn't matter if you're, a really, really great, holy, spiritual guy, so to speak, or, the town drunk. You're all getting wiped out at the hands of Rome, right? Yeah, what Jesus said, he nailed it on the head, right? Which shouldn't surprise us because he's Jesus, but Second thing that I think that Jesus says, which points to this, talking about Jerusalem falling in AD 70, is he says, the end of 44, they will not leave one stone on another, right? And of course, elsewhere in other places, Jesus says stuff very similar, right? I tell you, no stone will be left upon another on this temple, right? We're kind of familiar with this language. There's a very long quote from Josephus, and I'll try to break it down. But it accurately describes this like complete destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and again, basically proving that Jesus hit the nail on the head. He says, this is Josephus, he says, as soon as the army had no more people to slay or to plunder, because there remained none there to become objects of their fury. In other words, they had killed everyone already. Caesar gave orders that they should now demolish the entire city and the temple, but they should leave a few towers. And then I'm going to skip down because it's just a long quote talking about stuff. It talks about, they destroyed all the walls, they destroyed all the towers except a few watchtowers, but they spared one wall. And let me see. For the rest of the wall, though, that was destroyed. It was so thoroughly destroyed and laid even with the ground by those that dug it up to the foundation, that there was nothing left to make those that came to it believe it had ever been inhabited. In other words, they destroyed the walls of Jerusalem and the walls around the temple so much that people after the fact that were passing by never knew anyone ever lived there. I mean, that's like, you think the tornadoes around here are bad, but that's insane. All right. And then he says, this is the end which Jerusalem came to by the madness of those that were for innovations. And he says, a city otherwise of great magnificence and mighty fame among all mankind. So, by every other account, it was a great city, magnificent, mighty fame among mankind. Jerusalem had a good reputation. Obviously the temple was religiously important, culturally important, but also, it was an architectural feat of magnificence, right? Almost on the same level as like the Egyptian pyramids and stuff like that in terms of how they built it. But after the fact, not so much, right? After the fact, people didn't even really know that Jerusalem had ever been inhabited. He's probably being a little hyperbolic there, but nonetheless, again, proving that what Jesus said here in Luke 19 came true. The final part I want to talk about, and this is why I said I'm doing it out of order, is you go back up to verse, 43. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. Now this is probably the easiest part of Jesus' prophecy here to actually link directly with the historical record of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Because nobody disagrees that Jerusalem was besieged. They only disagree on how exactly that happened, there's differences on to the dating of when it happened. There's differences as to how many people died, that kind of thing. But nobody disagrees on the fact that Jerusalem was besieged and it was destroyed and just laid to waste. Nobody's arguing that, right? So this is the part of the prophecy that's incredibly easy to, yeah, Jesus obviously got this part right. I got another quote from Josephus. He says, talking about the siege wall, right? They basically built a siege wall around Jerusalem, and again, nothing comes in, nothing comes out, right? He writes, the length of this wall was 40 furlongs. I'll talk about that in a minute. With only one abated. At this wall, there were erected 13 places to keep garrisons whose circumference put together amounted to 10 furlongs. The whole was completed in 3 days, so that what would have naturally required some months was done in so short an interval as is incredible. So, talking about the length of this, where it says 40 furlongs minus 1, so like 39 furlongs, that's about 5 miles. So in 3 days, they built a 5-mile long wall all the way around Jerusalem. Nothing coming in, nothing coming out, right?
That must have had a lot of people working on that.
Oh, yeah, round the clock, I bet.
Yeah.
It's horrible, it's devastating, but it's also impressive in a sense, just from like a military standpoint, that in 3 days they were able to accomplish that much. Josephus goes on to explain what this meant. He writes, all hope of escaping was now cut off from the Jews, together with their liberty of going out of the city, right? Jesus says your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in. Again, hit it right on the head, right? One last quote that I think really explains the significance of being besieged, completely cut off, completely surrounded. It says, then did the famine widen its progress and devoured the people by whole houses and families. The upper rooms were full of dead bodies of the aged. The children also and the young men wandered around about the marketplace like shadows, all swelled with the famine, in other words, starving, basically, and fell down dead, wheresoever their misery seized them, right? So again, old and young, it didn't matter. Everybody was affected. If the lack of food didn't get you, the Roman army was sure to get you, right? And everything was just completely laid to waste. So everything that Jesus says here, is sort of prophesying against Jerusalem, absolutely came true, right? So then the question is, to get back to our bullet points and our blanks, why do I bother to get into all this? Is it because I'm a nerd? Well, partially, but I think, right, Luke wrote his gospel, and when Luke wrote his gospel, and when his original audience was reading his gospel, or more likely hearing his gospel, right? This is your next blank. This would have all been in recent memory, right? So your next blank, when Luke wrote his gospel and when his original audience was reading or hearing his gospel, this would be in recent memory, right? Because we dated Luke to sometime in the 70s AD, right? So you're not even a decade removed from all this having happened. If you're listening to this, this is being read in the synagogue or in your, First Baptist Church of Antioch or wherever you're at, you're going to go, oh, yeah, that happened just now. Jesus got it right. In the last few chapters of Luke, we've had multiple examples of Jesus describing that in-between time, in between his first coming and his second coming. Why is that? Well, it's because the original followers of Christ have already started to die off, right? We're like 40 years removed from Jesus' earthly ministry now. The original followers of Christ were dying off, and now, after Jerusalem falls, not only do you have these original disciples, original apostles dying off, but you have the headquarters of the whole thing, Jerusalem, is now destroyed. So you have a lot of people sitting around wondering, okay, we gave our lives to follow this guy who promised us he was coming back. Peter or, James or whoever, are dying off. And, all these people that sort of founded this movement are dying off. And now, we've always sort of been based around Jerusalem, and now Jerusalem's fallen and we can't really have Jerusalem be the central hub anymore. How do we carry on from here? So if you're reading this, if you're reading Luke's gospel or hearing Luke's gospel, this would have been incredibly relevant for you, right? Again, because this is all in recent memory, right? So, your next point. If you're hearing this gospel for the first time, having just witnessed the collapse of Jerusalem, you're probably going to feel immense encouragement that this was always part of the plan, right? As strange as that might sound to us, that's all throughout the Bible, Old and New Testament, right? Not only tragedy, but even wickedness and evil is part of God's plan, right? God uses the evil actions of people to bring about good, right? And there's so many parallels between when Babylon destroyed Jerusalem and exiled off the people, and when Rome destroyed Jerusalem. And there's the diaspora is what they call it, but basically, the few people that did survive just kind of spread everywhere all over, the world. So there's a lot of similarities, and if you go back and you read, especially like Habakkuk gets into this a lot. God, what is your answer for wickedness on earth? And God says, I'm going to destroy Jerusalem. And then Habakkuk says, wait. How can you, cause or allow wickedness as a response to human wickedness, right? And it's because then he comes around and says, hey, I'm punishing Jerusalem because it's wicked. I'm punishing Israel because it's wicked. And then, Babylon's going to be the one to do this, but then wait a little bit, and I'm going to turn around and punish Babylon too, right? It just sort of, the cycle continues. Very much the same way with Rome, by the way. Obviously, Rome was not built in a day, but it didn't take nearly as long for Rome to fall as it did for Rome to become an empire. But anyway, Luke's gospel gives the answer for how and why all of this happened, right? The destruction of Jerusalem. How did this happen? Why did this happen? Right? What caused this? Here in Luke chapter 19, he gives the answer in verse 44. He says, Jesus says, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. So your next blank. Not only did Jesus predict that Jerusalem would be destroyed, he explained why it would be destroyed, right? He didn't just predict, hey, one of these days Jerusalem's going to fall. Because here's the thing. Any country ever, you can predict that it's going to be destroyed, and eventually that's going to come true, right? You hate to think about it, but I can make a prediction that, one day America is going to be destroyed, and it will probably come true at some point, because no nation has ever lasted forever, right? I hope that when it happens, it's after I'm gone, but, that's just kind of the way the world works, right? But Jesus didn't just predict that Jerusalem would fall. He explained why it was going to happen, right? And the next half of that blank, why it would be destroyed and what that significance is, which is judgment, right? Judgment for their rejection of himself, right? Jesus says, hey, you reject me, you reject the time of the Lord's coming. And because of that, right, and there's sort of this aspect, and, I don't want to confuse you too much, but we talk about the second coming of Christ as referring to the stuff from the book of Revelation, right? In the Bible, it will talk about the day of the Lord's coming or something like that. Sometimes it does mean end of the world type stuff, but sometimes it just means the Lord coming to the earth in judgment, like what he did in the time of Noah, what he did in the time of, against Jerusalem, like with Babylon and stuff like that, and other times. So, many people understand the fall of Jerusalem as sort of being God coming in judgment against Jerusalem and the Jewish leaders, right? Many people understand it that way, and I think so, given what Jesus just said in verse 44. That's not to say that that's the second coming is again, referring to Revelation, But it is sort of Jesus coming back again in judgment, and then, as we know, there will be a worldwide judgment at the end of time. But anyway, right? As I already said, the destruction of Jerusalem allowed the church to expand outward from Jerusalem at a much greater rate than before, right? So, and there's different historical sources I could have pulled for this, but I didn't have the time or the mental energy to do it. But Google it, I'm sure it'll pull up. There are different sources that talk about many Christians actually fled Jerusalem not very long before it fell to the hands of Rome. And obviously the more religious of those sources attribute it to basically Jesus or the Father or the Spirit, whoever, sort of warning the Jerusalem Christians to get out of town. And then your more secular sources would just sort of chalk it up to whatever. But it's not the Bible, so I'm not going to say that it happened, but it seems pretty likely to me, given how many different sources talk about it. And as we know, the outcome of this is, again, 30 AD to 70 AD, Jerusalem was the hub. Jerusalem was the mother church, right? Everything was sort of revolving around Jerusalem, right? It's kind of like those churches that, they have different campuses now. So it's like, First Baptist Erick, and then, I don't know, pretend that we're like a huge church that can afford to do this. It's like, okay, well, First Baptist Erick Texola campus, First Baptist Erick Sayre campus, and but like everything sort of revolves around the main church campus, right? Like a lot of these churches, it's like the main campus pastor will preach, and then these other like smaller campuses will just play the live stream of that main campus, which I hate that, but anyway, that's kind of like what Jerusalem was. I mean, obviously not to that extent, but like, everything kind of went back to Jerusalem. That was like, big time decisions were made from the Jerusalem church, right? After Jerusalem fell, not so much. Christians, a lot of them, again, were able to escape. They got out in time, and because of that, not only is there sort of a decentralized nature to the church now, but the gospel's going out to places it never was before. Because as much as we talk about the Jewish diaspora, where all the Jews that escaped went all over the world, all the Christians that escaped also went all over the world. And what were they bringing with them? The gospel, right? So we might not even be here had it not been for Jerusalem falling, which is kind of crazy to think about.
So out of the bad, some good came. Well, a lot of good came.
Right. And that's your next blank, right? Even in judgment, there is both purpose and grace, right? So, judgment against Jerusalem, that's bad in the sense that, like, nobody wants to be under the judgment of God. But it's also good in that a lot of good came from that. And also, just for theological reasons, you shouldn't really call anything that God does as bad. That's, probably not a great thing to do. But, there is purpose in it, the expansion of the gospel, and there is grace, right? Grace for, even in the midst of this tragedy, all right? Now, very quickly, hopefully, let's circle back around to the actual triumphal entry itself, because I just talked a whole lot about verses 41 through 44 and kind of skipped the entirety of like 28 through 40, which is the actual like riding on a donkey part of the story, the part that people actually celebrate on Palm Sunday. No one, it's Palm Sunday. No one preaches a Palm Sunday sermon talking about destruction. It's always, the king is ridden into town. Hallelujah. Praise the Lord, So let's get into that part, right? The actual words that are used by the crowd. So what they say in verse 38, blessed is the king who comes in the name of the Lord. This is by and large taken from Psalm 118. That's your next blank. Taken from Psalm 118, verse 26. All right, now, what's interesting about Psalm 118 is that it also contains another verse which is often attributed to the Messiah, which is Psalm 118, verse 22, which reads, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, right? You reject Jesus, Jesus is now the cornerstone, right? Upon him is, this great mission, this great kingdom, whatever. So you have Psalm 118, verse 26, which is what the crowd is saying, and then verse 22 is the cornerstone part. So your next blank, it's ironic in a way that the crowd in Luke 19 quotes verse 26, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. It's ironic that they quote verse 26 while fulfilling verse 22 of Psalm 118. So they're quoting, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, but they're actually fulfilling verse 22, which is talking about rejecting Jesus. Let me reread that. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. So they're rejecting Jesus by and large, but they're quoting, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, right? So the question is, did the crowd even really know what they were saying, right? Truly, did they really understand what they were saying, right? One of the commentaries that I read, it actually points out that this psalm was used as a greeting for pilgrims that would enter Jerusalem on their way to festivals like Passover, which that's what Jesus is doing here, is he's entering Jerusalem for Passover. And this was just sort of a typical greeting. Oh, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, right? So it's similar to, in verse or chapter 9, verses 51 through 56. You don't need to flip there or anything. But, Jesus started this journey to Jerusalem way back in chapter 9. And now it's chapter 19. So, we've been on this journey for a while. We finally made it into Jerusalem. But when Jesus starts out, right, he sends these messengers ahead into Samaria. The messengers reject Jesus. And I talked about, when we covered chapter 9, I said, it's probably not so much that they're rejecting Jesus in and of himself, as much as they are rejecting him because he's a Jew. Because Samaritans would often reject and even sometimes physically harm Jews traveling through Samaria on their way to Jerusalem, regardless of who they were. It wasn't necessarily just because he was Jesus that they were rejecting him, as much as they are, I'm a Samaritan, you're a Jew, don't come into my country, right? Hippity hoppity, get off my property kind of a thing, right? Probably the same thing here, where, they're using this, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, probably not because they understand this is the Messiah, this is the Son of God, this is Jesus, as much as they are, well, you're a Jew, you're coming to Jerusalem for Passover, so this is my way of blessing you, this is my way of greeting you, that kind of a thing, right? There's no, there's a question as to, did the crowd at large say this, or was it just the disciples? Because Luke's account makes it seem like it was just the disciples that were saying this. Matthew's account does not limit it to just the disciples, but to the crowds of people that went before Jesus, right? Also, Matthew's account includes the city of Jerusalem as a whole being stirred up. So in other words, you have, Matthew's account, a large group of people, not just the 12, not just the 12 disciples, but a large group of people going before Jesus, preparing the way, all this stuff, shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And then you have everyone else in Jerusalem that's kind of watching this, and they're all stirred up. They're like, who's this Jesus guy? We need to figure out about this. We need to put a stop to this, right? So it's very likely that Jesus' fame here was sort of at an all-time high. Now what that means is, on the one hand, there were a lot of people who were very interested to see what Jesus was going to do. Because I've heard, little birdie told me, this guy's a miracle worker. I've heard, little birdie told me, this guy's a very good teacher. I've heard, this guy can cast out demons. I've heard, this guy is proclaimed to be king of Jerusalem, king of the Jews. And now this man who's done all this amazing stuff and who everyone is proclaiming to be king of Jerusalem, king of the Jews, son of David, is now riding into Jerusalem the week of the biggest religious event in the nation. A lot of people were interested. Did they all, were they saying this because they understood Jesus as the Messiah? Probably not. As much as they're interested to see what Jesus is going to do. Because on the one hand, again, you have people interested to see what Jesus is going to do during Passover week. On the other hand, you have people who were confused. You had people who were irritated, stirred up, and as it says in Luke 19, well, that's in the next set of verses we're about to read, you even had people that outright wanted to kill Jesus. So if you're watching this, and you're watching this man proclaimed to be King of Jerusalem ride in, you're probably going to be shouting, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," because you think everything's about to come to a head. Everything's about to come, to one last clash. And this guy that's proclaimed to be King of the Jews, King of Jerusalem, is going to ride in and on Passover week kick out the Romans and take the throne. That's probably what you're thinking, right? Those who went on before Jesus preparing the way, right? They probably understood some significance in Jesus, right? This is a quote. It says, "Jesus is much more than another pilgrim," and Luke makes this pretty clear with his including the word king. Because in Psalm 118 itself, it doesn't say, "Blessed is the king who comes in the name of the Lord." It just says, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Luke adds, "Blessed is the king who comes in the name of the Lord." So the crowd probably, again, understood, this very typical greeting we use of everyone. We're going to use it here to this guy. They had a little bit of an understanding that Jesus was special, but probably not all the way. They probably didn't see Jesus as the Son of God so much as this is David's descendant that's going to bring us back. We're going to have a kingdom. We're going to have a king again. We're going to kick out the Romans, that kind of a thing. Okay, very quickly. Chapter 19, verses 45 to 48. When Jesus entered the temple courts, he began to drive out those who were selling. "It is written," he said to them, "My house will be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." Every day he was teaching at the temple, but the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the leaders among the people were trying to kill him. Yet they could not find any way to do it because all the people hung on his words. Okay, my head has not been in frame into this thing the whole time, but it's too late to fix it now. But anyway, I'm just a headless pastor. I don't know.
That would be one of those just vote.
Like I said before, there are some people who understood Jesus, some people who were curious, some people who were just irritated or stirred up, and some people that outright wanted to kill Jesus, right? This section describes both. It talks about verse 47, those who were trying to kill him, but then you get to verse 48, and it talks about they couldn't kill him because of those who hung on his words, hanging on every word, right? Tensions are rising. Everything's about to come to a clash. We're in the final week of Jesus' life before his crucifixion. And you sort of have this small narrative, right? It doesn't really contribute to the overall narrative of Jesus' last week, other than the fact that because of what Jesus does, it makes people want to kill him, which ends up happening. But it's just sort of, Jesus comes into Jerusalem. Obviously, that needs to happen for him to die in Jerusalem. He has to celebrate Passover, the Last Supper. He has to be arrested. He has to be tried. He has to be crucified. He has to rise again. This is just kind of thrown in there. And there's several stories like that in the last week of Jesus that seemingly are just kind of thrown in there for fun. This is one of them. It's very small, only, verses 45 to 48. But I think it's often misunderstood, right? Because it's very small, but you hear it talked about a lot. You hear it preached on a lot, right? So this is your first blank for this section. The application of this passage is not that you shouldn't sell anything inside of a church, all right? If you have a problem selling stuff inside of a church, that's fine. I mean, I have no intention of, selling my, holy handkerchief or whatever inside of the church. So you don't have to worry about that. I'm just saying, I don't think that that's necessarily what this passage means. To understand what Jesus is getting at here, I think, once again, you need a little bit of background information, significantly less than the first section, but you need a little bit, all right? This is a quote from a commentary. It says, the incident took place in the court of the Gentiles, where one could purchase the necessary sacrifices, or at certain times during the year, exchange money for silver coins that were acceptable for paying the half-shekel temple tax. So this is your next blank. In other words, selling stuff was not only permitted, but expected. Selling stuff at the temple was not only permitted, but it was expected. I mean, it was part of day-to-day temple life, especially during Passover week, right? Especially when you have all these people, not just in Jerusalem, but from outside of Jerusalem that are coming in. They have to buy the stuff to make the sacrifices with, pay the temple tax, whatever. It was not just permitted, it was expected, right? So, your next blank. Let me make sure, because this is the part where what I have and what you have is a little bit different. There are similarities between this and Jeremiah 7, chapter 7, verses 9 to 11. Jeremiah 7, 9 through 11. So I will just read that real quick. It says, "Will you steal and murder, commit adultery and perjury, burn incense to Baal, and follow other gods you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which bears my name, and say, we are safe to do all these detestable things? Has this house, which bears my name, become a den of robbers to you? I have been watching, declares the Lord." Right? So, in other words, you have people that, they wouldn't have worshipped on a Sunday, but I'm going to say it this way anyway. Monday to Saturday, I commit adultery, I commit perjury, I commit theft, I do whatever, live my life however I want to, roll in Sunday morning and, roll up into town, roll up into the temple, and, all of a sudden, I'm a pretty good guy, I haven't done too much wrong, everybody sees me, they think I'm a good person, this and that, right? Jesus here at the ending of Luke chapter 19, he's not fed up with commerce on the temple grounds. He's not fed up with people selling stuff. That's not why Jesus is mad. It's not because they're selling stuff. What Jesus is fed up with is the fact that these sellers, and this is a quote from Luke 11:39, they clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside are full of greed and wickedness, right? It's the hypocrisy that Jesus is upset at. So that's your next point. It says, see Luke 11:39. All about the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and the religious leaders and all of this. 11:39. The outside, the part that people see, is they spruce up on Sundays. The inside is rotten to the core, right? A commentary that I read, it pointed out another significance here in what Jesus is saying, perhaps a greater significance than what we just talked about. He says, this action of, sort of rebuking people at the temple, this action probably had a symbolic connection with a stream of Jewish traditions about the end-time purification of the temple, or its final replacement by a new and better temple, where all the faults of the old and all of its worship were put to rest, right? So in other words, part of the messianic expectation was a new and better temple system, right? And think about this in relation to Jesus' prophecy that we talked about from the first section, verses 42 to 44, right? If part of the messianic expectation was a new and better temple system, then Jesus is not only prophesying out with the old, that's the first half of that blank. Jesus is not only prophesying out with the old, but he's also prophesying in with the new, right? In with the new and better, I will say, right? So like verses 42 through 44, right? Well, I'll just start in verse 43. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you, encircle you, hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and your children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another. That's out with the old. The old, the current temple, right? That's gone. Why is it gone? Because it's going to be leveled to the ground. It's going to be destroyed, right? In with the new is what we just read. It is written, my house will be a house of prayer, but you have made a den of robbers. If there's this significance of people understood that the future Messiah would come in and sort of clear the temple of evil and wrongdoing and sort of purify it, not only that, but make it new and better, then Jesus is not just saying out with the old, but hey, in with the new and in with the better, right? What for many people in 70 AD and even still today, right, is seen as a tragedy, perhaps is the largest blessing and the biggest revolution in the way that we worship God the Father, right? Why? Well, we don't have to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem anymore, right? Which I'm glad, because right now Jerusalem is in a mess and plane tickets are very expensive, right? We don't need to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem anymore. Why? Because we don't need a temple in Jerusalem anymore. Why? Because this is the blank. We are the temple in which God dwells through his Spirit, and we are the sacrifice, right? We are the temple in which God dwells through his Spirit, and we are the sacrifice. Now, let me explain, and I've said this before on Sunday mornings, but let me say it anyway, right? Yes, in a what saves me, what makes me right with God, what justifies me before the Father, yes, 100%, absolutely, Jesus Christ is the sacrifice, okay? But think about the Old Testament. People that made sacrifices in the Old Testament, their sacrifice did not make them right with God. Their sacrifice did not save them. Their sacrifice did not forgive them of their sins. It was their act of obedience. It was how they showed their faith or their dependence on God to justify them, right? The same way, when I say we are the sacrifice under the new covenant of Jesus Christ, what I mean is the way that we think, the way that we act, the way that we live our lives shows our faith or dependence on God alone to justify us, right? It's the same concept. I got two verses for you, and then we'll be done. Romans 12, verse 1 says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship," right? So your bodies as a sacrifice. What does that mean? Start a jazzercise club at church. I've heard some people say that. I don't think that's what Paul means. I think he means, again, the way we think, the way we live our minds, right? We are the sacrifice. And then also 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 19 through 20 say this: "Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you, who you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies." Right? So, out with the old, in with the new, and better. Well, what's better than having this great, beautiful, magnificent piece of architecture in Jerusalem, having a beautiful, magnificent Holy Spirit that lives inside of us, right? I would say that that's better. I would take that trade any day of the week. But anyway, any questions or anything about any of that?